I'd like to just introduce, it's Professor Richard de Thijs. Richard, I hope I pronounced it right.
It is de Thijs.
Thanks. I had to check it.
No worries.
Now, Richard's a distinguished academic, and he's worked in, or his specialty is in astronomy and astrophysics, which I think is probably beyond most of us, Richard. He's worked at universities in the USA and China, and he's currently at Macquarie University, where he's the professor of astrophysics. Richard's a volunteer at the National Maritime Museum as well, as a tour guide and a member of the presenters program. So Richard, it's a privilege for us to have you here today, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to an interesting presentation. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Right, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to present this very interesting story, at least I think it's interesting, to the organization, which I've heard a lot about because, as was said at the introduction, I'm one of the speakers of the Australian National Maritime Museum, and of course, your speakers coordinator is Noel Phelan, who is our fearless leader as Maritime Museum speakers representative. This story I'm going to talk about will focus mostly on a little Navy vessel called the HMAS Wyatt Earp. And I got interested in this because I'm a scientist, as was said, and I'm also very interested in the history of maritime shipping and naval exploration. And so it turns out that HMAS Wyatt Earp was so far the first and only Australian Navy vessel, Australian Navy expedition that included both exploration and science. And I won't go into much of the science, but I'd like to talk about the Wyatt Earp. Now, from talking to some of you earlier, I understand that a number of you know a fair amount about the vessel. And I even saw that the person who wrote the definitive story of Wyatt Earp, Trish Burgess, is actually online. So that puts me under a bit of pressure, but I'll do my best to make it interesting. I have a number of newsreels from the 1940s, etc., that I think you'll find interesting as well. So, first of all, the picture here in the background is the vessel. She was called at the time just the Wyatt Earp, not HMAS. This was taken in 1936 during one of the 4 Lincoln Ellsworth expeditions to Antarctica. And you can see it was a small vessel, and she was carrying a float plane. And the float plane in this case was called the Polar Star. Most of my story will be about the 1947-1948 ANARI, the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, undertaken at the time to establish a physical presence, an Australian physical presence on the Antarctic continent. And this is what the vessel looked like at the time. But before we go there, I'd like to give you a bit of context as to what Australian involvement has been in Antarctic exploration. And Australian involvement starts in 1895. And on the 24th of January, 1895, a small party of sealers and whalers landed on Cape Adare, which is right there at the bottom of the screen. Australia and New Zealand are at the very bottom of the screen. At the extension here of the Antarctic Peninsula, we have South America. So that's kind of the orientation we're looking at. Now, on the 24th of January, 1895, this party was a Norwegian sealing and whaling party. And one of their members was a Norwegian fellow by the name of Karsten Egeberg Borchgrevink. But so not Australian, but he was based in Melbourne. He was a Melburnian, in terms of his residency. The photos on the screen show you what he looked like, and also what the very first station looked like that they built at Cape Adare. That was Ridley Station. Karsten Egeberg Borchgrevink had signed on to this Norwegian expedition that was his job title, a generally useful hand. I don't think we have job titles like that anymore, but that's interesting anyway. Following on from there, a second expedition was undertaken, again to Cape Adare, now led by, or including the Australian Louis Bernacchi, who was an Australian citizen and led by this Norwegian generally useful hand Borchgrevink. This was the first winter over expedition, and it was the Southern Cross expedition. That was the name of the vessel. Louis Bernacchi is shown at top left there, He also, later on, in between 1901 and 1904, he joined Robert Falcon Scott's expedition to the South Pole. He was a physicist and the only person who had been to Antarctica before in that party of Robert Falcon Scott. Scott and Bernacchi became very good friends, to the extent that Scott was Bernacchi's best man when Bernacchi got married in 1906. Following on from there, 1907 to 1909, we have an expedition, a very famous expedition led by Ernest Shackleton, that went to Mount Erebus. Mount Erebus is close to the American McMurdo station, which is a present-day station, of course, on Ross Island, here in the Ross Sea, or this is also called the Bay of Whales. And that expedition also went to the magnetic South Pole. You can see the magnetic South Pole is just off the coast of the Antarctic continent. Now, and to make it a bit scientific and a bit more complicated, that's actually the magnetic North Pole of the Earth. I'm currently teaching a first-year class on magnetism at Macquarie Uni, and no one actually realizes that close to the geographic South Pole, we actually have the magnetic North Pole. So this makes things a bit complicated, but that's just the way physics works. In any case, that was the Nimrod expedition, and that was Shackleton's ship was called the Nimrod. And that included two Australians, Douglas Mawson of Antarctic exploration fame, and his mentor Edgeworth David. The photo at bottom right shows shows Shackleton and the two Australians, and I believe that Mawson was the middle person, but I'm not entirely sure about that. This was the first expedition on which they actually pulled a sledge behind them, and they went on a hike of more than 100 miles to Mount Erebus. So this was quite a significant expedition, and it took a lot of effort. Following on from there, the next expedition from 1911 to 1914 was led by Douglas Mawson. It went to Commonwealth Bay, which is that small bay at the bottom of the continent that you can see there, and also to Queen Mary Land. Queen Mary Land is a wedge that goes from the coast all the way up down to the South Pole, and it's still today part of the Australian Antarctic Territory. To be honest, Australian Antarctic Territory is the largest section of land claimed by any nation in the Antarctic, so Australia claims a lot of land. That expedition, as I said, was the Australasian Antarctic expedition. It went to Commonwealth Bay, Queen Mary Land, and to Macquarie Island. Macquarie Island is a sub-Antarctic island south of, let's say, Tasmania. You can see the map on the right here. I have indicated in red the location of Macquarie Island. This is a map of known Antarctic territory up to 1910. And you can see that hardly anything was known at the time. Commonwealth Bay and the wedge towards the geographic South Pole was pretty much all that was known, and a few coastal features. This expedition was led by Douglas Mawson on the steam yacht Aurora, which is shown bottom left of the screen. It's become a famous expedition, but it was kind of disastrous, and it turned out into almost a full disaster. From mid-November 1912, an expedition of 3 men and their dogs went on an exploration of the coastline, and 2 of the 3 men died, Minnes and Mertz. Only Mawson returned, and they were forced to eat their dogs to have some sustenance, but that was a bad idea because they ate the dogs' livers, and they were toxic to humans. So Mawson, upon his return to his starting point, was quite severely ill, actually. Now, where is this located? You can see those 2 peninsulas there. That's equivalent to the very bottom here, where there are also 2 peninsulas down there. So that's the area that they explored. Following on from this expedition in 1912, 1913, and up to 1914, the next expedition again was led by now Sir Douglas Mawson. Between 1929 and 1931, it was the British, Australian, and New Zealand Antarctic Research Expedition, BANZARI. And during that expedition, Douglas Mawson proclaimed part of Antarctica as Australian sovereign territory. I'd like to share a short newsreel with you in which that proclamation is made.
I, Sir Douglas Mawson, do hereby proclaim and declare to all men that from and after the date of these present, full sovereignty of the territory which we have discovered and explored south of latitude 64 degrees and as far as the South Pole, this in His Majesty, King George V, his heirs and successors forever.
I should, of course, correct myself. This was not Australian sovereignty, it was British sovereignty. The Australian Antarctic Territory was created 2 years after that expedition by a British Order in Council and the Australian Antarctic Territory Acceptance Act. So that's the context in which we're talking about the Wyatt Earp as a ship. After following this proclamation, the next major set of Antarctic voyages and expeditions was undertaken by the American explorer Lincoln Ellsworth. Lincoln Ellsworth was famous for his North Polar exploration. He overflew the Arctic for the first time, and he wanted to do something similar across the Antarctic. And so he asked his right-hand man, Hubert Wilkins, the Australian Hubert Wilkins, to look for a suitable vessel. And eventually, Wilkins found a vessel in ports in Norway. The vessel was called MS, as in motor ship, Fanefjord, and he actually Wilkins acquired that vessel for the expeditions to be undertaken by Ellsworth and his team. The vessel was renamed Wyatt Earp. Here are some photos of the vessel near Cape Horn, and you can see quite heavy seas in the southern oceans. This was on the way to Antarctica. Now I've got a clipping there as well from a newspaper that refers to the Wyatt Earp as a converted herring boat. The vessel was never built as a fishing vessel. She was a cargo ship and occasionally used for fishing as well, but she was not a fishing boat. And that is a misconception that you actually encounter fairly regularly when you go and do some research about the ship online. Here are some photos of the Fanefjord being laid down and being launched at the Bolsøne shipyard in Molde. Molde is just inside of one of the fjords of the west coast of Norway, and that is the Fanefjord. So the ship is named after the location where she was built. You can see what it looks like. And so after she was acquired, and so for about 14 years, she plowed the North Sea and the Arctic Ocean in the north as a cargo vessel and here and there once in a while as a fishing vessel. When she was acquired by Wilkins for the Ellsworth expeditions, she was renamed Wyatt Earp, and you might wonder why. Lincoln Ellsworth was a big fan of the two-gun toting sheriff Wyatt Earp from OK Corral fame in Arizona, and so that's why he named his ship the MV Wyatt, or the motor vessel Wyatt Earp. Here's a photo of one of the films made about Wyatt Earp. This is the 1994 rendition with Kevin Costner in the role as the sheriff, but there have been quite a few more movies. Lincoln Ellsworth, top left, and Hubert Wilkins, top right, were among about 17 crew members of the Ellsworth expeditions, and their plan was to overfly the Antarctic. So that's at the bottom, you see their plane. And I'll talk about the plane in just a second. Here is a photo of the Wyatt Earp somewhere in southern waters. It is not entirely clear where this is. There is no information on the Maritime Museum website from which I took this. It's thought that this might have been near or in the waters of New Zealand, but it's not entirely clear to me. Ellsworth undertook 4 expeditions between 1933 and 1939. Here are some of the photos of those expeditions. You can also see that they had a float plane, and that float plane, the Polar Star, was used to take off from the ice floes or sometimes from the water. The plane has been preserved and is currently on display at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. in the United States. Instead of me blabbering on, I would like to share with you a brief video about the first attempt of Lincoln Ellsworth to overfly the Antarctic and the potential disaster that resulted from that attempt.
Lincoln Ellsworth, the American polar explorer, set out for a voyage over the Antarctic and disappeared into a silence that engulfs all too often the pioneer who seeks to conquer nature. Over the frozen wastes, a dozen search parties were sent out to seek the famous scientist. From his base ship at Dundee Island, Ellsworth planned his flight to Little America, his most dangerous dash since he went with Amundsen to the North Pole 9 years ago. The 2,000-mile adventure began, on toward the unexplored regions beyond man's present knowledge, braving the guessed and unguessed perils of the South Pole. Came trouble, a wireless flash, incoherent and unintelligible. One more famous man at risk of his life sought to wrest the secrets of science from the forbidding, treacherous Antarctic.
So this was from the 1935-1936 expedition, and Ellsworth's plane was lost. Potentially disastrous, but let me share the next newsreel, which is about 3 minutes, that shows what happened from that point onwards.
They all make some big film stars someday. You think? I think. The annals of polar exploration have yielded another epic story of bravery, endurance, and fortunately this time happy ending. Of the relief of Lincoln Ellsworth and his companion, Herbert Hollick Kenyon, lost on the Antarctic ice cap for over 7 weeks, the rescue ship Discovery II brings back these thrilling pictures. The first scene is on December the 13th off Melbourne, where on the initiative of the Australian government, the Royal Research Ship Discovery, diverted from its scientific duties, takes aboard Royal Australian Air Force planes to search for the lost aviators. Thence to New Zealand, where only a brief stay is made before heading south to the Bay of Whales off Little America. On the voyage, sledges for the planes are prepared, and the Wapiti and Martha kept constantly tuned up, for on their effectiveness will depend the hopes of success. Discovery strikes the ice pack on January the 12th at the mouth of the Ross Sea. Between here and her destination, the Bay of Whales, 500 miles away, the ship has to negotiate sheet after sheet of this broken mass, and with the help of her planes to find the best leads through it. Penguins are puzzled spectators of Discovery's progress and waddle away while the crew make heroic efforts to sheer off from the ice. The Wapiti's pilot, Flight Lieutenant Douglas, prospects a large floe as a takeoff ground for his plane if fitted with skis. But 2 days later, the Bay of Whales is reached, and the plane, still wearing her floats, leaves the water to search the surrounding snow for the lost men. Probably, it seemed that they had a long task ahead of them. But, amazing fortune, on the first day, a lone figure, that of Hollick Kenyon, is sighted. Then a party on foot sets out to locate Ellsworth. Here is the actual shot of their meeting. Ellsworth advancing to meet his rescuers. And a group taken immediately afterwards, Ellsworth in the center. Joyfully, the party treks back to the ship. On the way home, Ellsworth and Hollick Kenyon, his Canadian companion, aboard Discovery. Hollick Kenyon transfers to the Wyatt Earp, Ellsworth's own base vessel, which saw him take off from Dundee Island to fly across the polar wastes to Little America. Meanwhile, Discovery plows back to Melbourne through rough seas with Ellsworth on board. And at Melbourne, Australia welcomes the rescued adventurer, whose relief the Commonwealth government had done so much to achieve. I thank you for your kind words and feel deeply touched with this nice welcome to Australia, and deeply grateful to the Australian government for the help they have rendered to my expedition.
So ends another tale of explorers' valor. And looking back a little way in the story, let us finish on a picture of Ellsworth's home in the snow and marvel that man could survive for 7 weeks under such exposure.
So everything turned out well, fortunately. What happened is that the Wyatt Earp had to sail all around the Antarctic continent to get to the Bay of Whales. And so she was just beaten by the Discovery II in arriving at that particular location for a potential rescue mission. So here we have a photo from the Discovery II off the Wyatt Earp, somewhat in the distance, just arriving at the Bay of Whales. Ellsworth and his companion, Hollick Kenyon, had landed just a bit short of the coast because they ran out of fuel, I'm told. And so they walked on skis or on snowshoes to an American camp called Little America, which contained a lot of provisions that had been left by the American explorer Captain Byrd some decades earlier. So that was very lucky. And so they managed to survive there for 7 weeks until they were rescued. Here is another photo now of the Wyatt Earp alongside an ice floe. And so that's another claim to fame of this little ship. I would like to point out, though, that when Ellsworth flew across the Antarctic Peninsula, well, the continent, but mostly the peninsula, he overflew a mountain range, which are now called the Ellsworth Mountains. And one of those mountains is referred to as Mount Earp. So this is the only mountain that I'm aware of that's been named after a ship. I'm aware of a few ships named after mountains, but I think this is the only mountain on Earth named after a ship. So that's a little side information that might be of interest here. Right. Now, at the end of the 4th expedition, both Wilkins and Ellsworth actually claimed large areas of Antarctica for their respective countries, the United States and Australia, which was immediately denied by the other country. So there was a bit of geopolitical rivalry already at this point. By the time they returned from their 4th expedition to Australia, the Commonwealth government decided to purchase the ship for reportedly £440,000 at the time, including the plane and everything. And the ship was put to use as an examination and guard ship in the port of Whyalla during the Second World War. She was renamed to HMAS Wongala. Wongala means boomerang in the Yuibara language of the Port Macquarie region of Queensland. You can see that Wongala had 2 guns on board, 2 Oerlikon machine guns. There's one here, and there's one on the other side. Most other examination and guard vessels only had one of them. So the Wongala had the advantage that she could sail both, forward and in reverse when escorting any suspect vessels getting into port. So that was actually quite useful. So during the Second World War, she was an examination and guard ship. At the end of the Second World War, she was given on loan to the Sea Scouts in Port Adelaide, and she became a Sea Scout training ship, SSTS Wongala, still the same name, until sometime later when the Australian authorities realized that Antarctica was becoming a hot continent, in the sense that the United States and Norway, among other countries, were interested in expanding their spheres of influence. And so it was realized, and this is a quote that actually underscores that, if we do not take this sector and claim sovereignty over it, some other country will. So there was an urgency to establish a physical base and not just, declare from their capital cities whatever part would be the sovereign sovereign component of the country, but to actually establish a physical base to claim that sovereignty. And so this is from Pix magazine from 1947. There was not enough time or money to search for a vessel that could be used to establish that physical base until Sir Douglas Mawson at the time remembered that the former Wyatt Earp was actually a Commonwealth government vessel, and so he suggested to refurbish Wyatt Earp or Wongala, of course, at the time, and make her suitable as an expedition vessel. So here are some of the drawings of the proposed refurbishment of the vessel in 1947. You can see there is a float plane on top there as well. I found this in Walkabout magazine from April 1948, where it showed what had been done to the vessel. She had the size had been made higher. She had been extended a little bit. They had added a chart room. They had added a cosmic ray laboratory, which was meant for scientific experiments. They had added more accommodation so that the ship could carry 37 crew members instead of the 17 that Ellsworth had taken on his voyage. So the vessel looked quite different, or became a bit bigger in essence. This is what she looked like in Williamstown dockyard, or Williamstown along the quay, after her refurbishment. On the 13th of December 1947, the ship left from Port Adelaide to Melbourne, and you can see some photos here of what the ship looked like at the time. She had a Vogt Sikorsky OS2U Kingfisher float plane, and the men refer to the plane as old, slow, and ugly, given the OS2U abbreviation there, which I thought was quite funny. And on the 19th of December, a first attempt was made to sail down to the Antarctic from Melbourne. Here she is departing from Melbourne, all ready to go south. But soon after departure from Melbourne, disaster struck for a number of reasons. First of all, the ship had been refurbished and there was a lot of new outside planking, but the seams between the planks appeared to be leaky like hell. They tried to fix it whenever the seas were quiet. You can see on the right-hand side here, that picture of two men on the outside trying to fix the leakage, but apparently they couldn't actually manage to sort it out. The ship remained leaking throughout the remainder of her voyages. There was always about 3 inches of water sloshing around the accommodation, very uncomfortable. She had a 400 horsepower engine, but that only allowed her to go about 8.5 knots with the sails on. She had sails as auxiliary means of movement. They could go up to 10.5 knots. So that's less than 20 kilometers per hour for a huge distance. So not very fast, not very stable either, because the ship was had a round keel, did not have bilge keels to stabilize her. So in any weather, she was rolling 40 degrees one side to 40 degrees to the other side and back in 4.5 seconds. And in bad weather, that could go to 55 degrees on one side to 55 degrees on the other and back in that same period of time. You can imagine that anything that was loose and not tied down would be flung all over the place. And that included people sleeping in their bed. So it must have been very uncomfortable. It was wet. It was incredibly unstable. Yet the men made the best of it. Nevertheless, because of the leakage problem, on the 1st of January 1948, the ship was recalled forthwith to dry dock for refurbishment and later on a second attempt at exploring the Antarctic. Here she is in dry dock in Williamstown in Greater Melbourne. And a few more pictures of her refurbishment. And she was then subjected to a few speed and anchoring trials in Port Phillip Bay. That's the port in Melbourne. And before a second attempt was undertaken, leaving Melbourne on the 8th of February 1948. This is the Wyatt Earp, HMAS Wyatt Earp now, in Hobart alongside Elizabeth Street Pier. I did not tell you why the ship was renamed HMAS Wyatt Earp for this expedition, given that it might be strange to have an Australian Navy vessel named after an American sheriff. Well, the reason for this was that it was felt that Wyatt Earp was a name that was well established in the Antarctic region because of Lincoln Ellsworth's expeditions, so his 4 expeditions. And so the suggestion was made to rename the ship to Wyatt Earp just for consistency and because it was a well-known name in Antarctic exploration. When she was alongside Elizabeth Street Pier in Hobart, the main engine jammed, so the ship became more difficult to control and she actually rammed the pier. Another disaster in the making. Fortunately, neither the pier nor the ship sustained damage, so they managed to actually set off and go on an exploration to the far south. Let me share the following newsreel with you that gives you an impression of what happened on board.
Soon after leaving Melbourne, the scientific party starts work. Balloons are followed by special theodolites to determine the strength and direction of the upper winds. Philip Law, Senior Scientific Officer at the eyepiece, is assisting Fritz Lerver, famous for his meteorological observations in Greenland. Under Law's care, this complicated apparatus takes a continuous count of cosmic rays, a mysterious form of radiation originating in outer space. Soon the long green rollers of the roaring 40s make life less pleasant. And though the ship is well found, the terrific lurching and plunging show up a few weaknesses. At the first break in the weather, seams are corked and small leaks in the bulwarks are patched with red lead and canvas. Leading seaman Gilbert is a great friend of Mimi. She comes from a line of explorers. Her grandmother sailed in the Discovery. However, friendship gives way to duty when the watch below is called, and it will be cold on deck in another raging storm. At 4 to 5 knots, the ship makes little progress on its 1,200-mile voyage to the ice. But the wind is now astern, and the sails help to steady the ship, making her easier to steer. The lookout spots the first ice ahead. Most of those on board are seeing real ice for the first time as the ship steams slowly past these majestic domed icebergs, which have broken off from the Ninnis Glacier.
Right. So you saw that it was difficult, particularly in heavy seas. And one of the things that caused the difficulty was that the ship was rolling like mad because she was not very stable. Had a round keel, as I said, and no bilge keels. Bilge keels are those things on the side that have these blue dashes go around them, and they tend to stabilize ships. But this ship was not stabilized, so it was quite uncomfortable. 10 days after departure, they saw their first icebergs on the 18th of February 1948. This is actually taken on that day, and the person in the foreground is one of the crew members, and I believe that's a gentleman by the name of Cook. It's Lieutenant Commander W. Frank Cook. And so they attempted to make their way in the Bay of Wales to the Antarctic continent, but they were hampered by ice floes. They actually couldn't get any closer than about 30 miles of the continent. And so instead, Captain Karl Ohm, decided to divert to the Bellini Islands. The Bellini Islands are a small group of about 3 main islands and some smaller ones owned by New Zealand. They're in the far south. They are named after John Bellini, the American captain who discovered the islands in 1839. Again, I have a newsreel I'd like to share with you about that.
Though the Kingfisher is made ready under the supervision of Robin Gray, the weather remains too bad for a reconnaissance flight, which might have shown a way through the pack ice southward to Commonwealth Bay. So a course is set for the little-known Bellini Islands, a New Zealand possession several hundred miles to the east. When Captain John Bellini discovered the group, he reported them to be volcanically active. Today they lie dormant, looking like huge slices of iced plum cake. A comprehensive survey is made from the ship by its captain, Commander K.E. OBE. However, landing is limited to one brief hazardous attempt. On this occasion, only a few geological specimens could be obtained. But many more are taken from ice floes at the foot of the cliffs by Knocker White. Originally embedded in the base of the floe, the presence of these stones on top of the floe is due to melting of the surface, the melted water passing down through holes and refreezing down below, thus forcing the stones up. Leaving these islands, the Wyatt Earp returns to the massed icebergs of the Ninnis Glacier tongue in one more attempt to reach the Antarctic continent. In a stretch of ice-free water, the Kingfisher is sent off to look for an open path to the south. But the report is not good. Between the ship and the coast are many huge icebergs grounded in shallow water, with the waterways between them heavily choked with old pressure ice. From the air, these icebergs look insignificant until they are compared with the Wyatt Earp, and it is remembered that they extend about 1,000 feet below the surface.
Right. So they went to the Bellini Islands. That was not just a useless diversion. They actually did a lot of hydrography. So they mapped the seabed and the coastline for future safe shipping practices. They landed on one of the islands, the largest of them, which is called Young Island. Now, I mentioned that they got stuck in the ice. They tried to reach, the first time they tried to reach the Bay of Wales, got to about 30 miles from the Bay of Wales. The second time, after having visited the Bellini Islands, they attempted to get to Commonwealth Bay, which is close to that Cape Adair that we started with today, and they didn't get any closer than 40 miles from the coast. So the main task of establishing a permanent settlement, a permanent presence on the Antarctic continent, did not happen. They were unsuccessful. Now, while alongside the ice floes, they actually could cut and melt ice and tank it, so they had more fresh water. Because in addition to all of the difficulties that they faced already, to add insult to injury, they did not have a freshwater generator on board. So fresh water was heavily rationed unless and until they got to the ice floes, where they actually could take fresh water on board. So that's shown here. They went on a number of exploratory missions with the Kingfisher float plane and on skis. You can see at the bottom here, one of the officers is exploring the ice floe to see if it could be used for landing of the plane or departing. Here's another few pictures of the Kingfisher float plane being prepared for takeoff. But in the end, they didn't manage to get to the Antarctic continent. Once again, here are some examples of the places that they went to. The Commonwealth Bay is shown at bottom left, indicated in the red outline. The Bellini Islands are shown there as well. And after being unsuccessful in landing on the Antarctic continent, they decided to go home and stop at Macquarie Island. Macquarie Island is an Australian possession, and at the time, at the same time that the Wyatt Earp was exploring the Antarctic continent, another vessel, the landing ship tanks LST-3501, was busy landing stores on Macquarie Island to set up the first research station on Macquarie Island, which is still operational today. Just checking where I'm going next. Here's some more photos of their trip. This is still the Bellini Islands. This slide is a bit out of order, I can tell, but you can see how inhospitable those islands look, and a few more of those. I'll share my next newsreel with you, which is about their landing at Macquarie Islands.
Nearly 600 drums of oil for heating and cooking a lamp. Meanwhile, lighter equipment is pouring ashore from boat and barge. Cases of food, delicate scientific instruments, prefabricated huts and sections, everything to equip the landing party for its 15 months lonely vigil. Still reconnoitering. While operations are suspended due to heavy groundswell, the Walrus aircraft is sent aloft and the island is photographed. Over the radio, the pilot, Flight Lieutenant M. Smith, describes the magnificent spectacle. After its initial flight, the Walrus is parked on the beach. It's getting so crowded that it begins to look like the beachhead at Normandy. That's quite enough. Having been officially appointed postmaster at Kurgun Island, Campbell gets to work cancelling stamps on letters for every country in the world. He is assisted by Lem Macy, senior radio operator. The reconnaissance party reports. At last, the final boatload of equipment is landed, and the laborious task of leveling foundations, erecting huts, and settling in is commenced. To mark the founding of this new Australian settlement, the island party and the ship's company stand to attention while the leader raises the colours. Stuart Campbell's signature to the proclamation of occupation is followed by that of Lieutenant Commander G.M. Dixon, DSC, officer commanding LST 3501. The LST's job is done, and she prepares to sail, leaving 15 young observers alone for 15 months. The landing has been a success, but there have been many hazards. The Walrus, wrecked by gales, bears eloquent testimony.
Right, it's actually interesting to see that footage of the Australian flag being raised on Macquarie Island. They did not have. This was not sanctioned by the Commonwealth government at the time, and it actually led to very serious protests from the United States. So it's interesting that this was shown on television at the time. You also saw at the end of this newsreel that their Walrus plane, which had flown only once actually from there, got wrecked by gales. The plane is now back on mainland Australia, and it has been restored, and I believe it's somewhere at a museum in Victoria. Macquarie Island was established as a research station at the time by the ANARI, the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, and it is still an active research station today run by the Australian Antarctic Program. Here are some photos of the early settlement of Macquarie Island. The photo at top right is a whaling station from 1911. The photo bottom left is one of the early photos of the research station. This is from 1953. Following the other thing that I should mention here, so what the HMAS Wyatt Earp encountered LST 3501, and this was the first time in 50 odd days or so that the men on board the Wyatt Earp could actually take a hot shower. And so this was creature comforts, and they were happy, of course. They were also offered a drink, alcoholic drink that is, but instead they actually decided to go on land and try to actually continue with their mission. So that was quite good. Following their departure from Macquarie Island, it was all smooth sailing back to Melbourne. Even traversing Bass Strait was not a problem. It was very, very smooth and flat. On the 31st of March 48, HMAS Wyatt Earp returned to Port Phillip Bay, a day earlier than expected, actually. But that was the end of Antarctic exploration by this vessel. She was deemed too small for the number of crew, stores, and the float plane on board, and so she was subsequently mothballed and given in the care of the Department of Supply, the federal government Department of Supply. 3 years later, she was mothballed in Williamstown, Greater Melbourne. 3 years later, the ship was put up for sale, and in 1951, she was renamed Wongala and sold to the Argyle Shipping Company in Tasmania, just as a cargo vessel. So we've gone full circle from an original cargo vessel to a cargo vessel again in the early 1950s. A couple of years after that, in 1956, she was renamed once again, a final time, to Natone, and sold to the Sydney Ulverstone Shipping Company. And here is Natone passing underneath Sydney Harbour Bridge around that time. I have a painting of the ship here, which I think is incorrect, because the ship is named Wongala and it says Sydney, but during her lifetime, as far as I can tell, she was never Wongala in Sydney. So this is I think this is artistic freedom taken one step too far, perhaps. As Natone, she was used as a cargo vessel, also as a cattle carrier, and she did a lot of trade with Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and islands in that general area. In January 1959, her luck ran out. She was trying to outrun a cyclone by going further south, but disaster struck, and eventually the ship was beached at Mudlow Rocks at Rainbow Beach in Queensland, where she ended her life. Fortunately, all of the crew on board were saved. Here are some more photos. The weather-battered timbers of Natone are still visible occasionally when wind and ocean currents play nice together. Her screw has been recovered by one of the diving companies out in that area. And I've got a 1.5 minute movie that actually gives you a bit more background about that recovery of the screw.
About 12 months of diving out there in my spare time to locate the remains of the Wyatt Earp. I believe she was operating as a cattle carrier between Papua New Guinea and Townsville. And there was a horrible cyclone. I think it was Cyclone Beatrice. And she was getting horribly battered around by Beatrice. And so she ran south to escape the cyclone. In doing so, the timbers started to split and the ship was taking water. And she was going to go down. The engines snuffed because the engine space flooded and the pumps wouldn't keep up. So the captain at the time saw the lights of Rainbow Beach, which was nothing but a sand mining camp, which is on the site where the Surf Life Saving Club is today. And so he saw those lights and just went straight at it. And ran it up on Mudlow Rocks, and the Papuan crew were instrumental in saving most of the.
So that was a good end in the end, after all. Now, that was not the end of the name Wyatt Earp in the Antarctic, though. The Australian Navy still owns a vessel called ASV, as in Antarctic Survey Vessel, Wyatt Earp. She's equipped with state-of-the-art hydrographic survey instruments, and so she's now used to map the ocean bed and make sure that future shipping will be safe, because we want to know, of course, where all the obstacles are. So that's the end of my story about Wyatt Earp. If you want to, and this is not the end of the presentation, but if you want to know more about Wyatt Earp, I can recommend 2 books. The author of the book on the left is actually on this call, and it's a very readable account of the ship, and what I've just told you you will find back in that book and a lot more. The book on the right is the personal diary of Philip Law, the Chief Scientific Officer. It's a bit more, let's say, serious, or perhaps a bit more dry to get through, but still a very interesting account as well. So I can highly recommend these 2 books if you like. Now, I was talking to your presentation manager, Noel Phelan. He said, well, there is an important event happening around this time. The new Australian icebreaker Nuyina is due to arrive in Australia this week, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So I've added a few more slides to this presentation to tell you what happened after Wyatt Earp's exploration of the Antarctic. First of all, let's go back to this landing ship tank LST 3501. Here are some pictures of her. She was a very long vessel. She was originally constructed in Canada in 1944, and she was used for landing troops in Sicily during the Second World War. She was a Royal Navy vessel, a British Royal Navy. She was then stationed in Singapore and given on loan to the Australian Navy in around 1947, I believe, 1948, around that time. And she was used to supply the Australian stations on the sub-Antarctic islands of Macquarie Island, as we saw, but also Heard Island for a number of years afterwards. You can see an old map from the time at bottom right here, where you can see that Heard Island is pretty much halfway between Perth and South Africa. And so it's really remote. And for a number of years, Australia maintained a presence there in the form of an overwinter research station. It's no longer operational at the moment, as far as I know. Here's at the top here is a picture of the settlement on Heard Island. Also the ship's logo. She was renamed from LST 3501. I have to check it on the 2nd of November 1948 to HMAS Labuan, because it was felt that ships needed to have names that were more personalized, and Labuan was one of the landing sites or one of the battles in Southeast Asia during the Second World War. On the 28th of September 1951, only about 4 years after she was first put in service, she was decommissioned, towed to Hong Kong for scrap metal, and then from there to Japan. I see it. I mentioned the question in the chat. I mentioned that actually earlier, but I'll get back to it at the end. Okay. Right. Going on from here. So here you can see Australia maintains a number of stations on the coast of the Antarctic continent: Casey Station, Davis Station, Mawson, and also Macquarie Islands, shown here on the right, and Heard Islands. That island up there, by the way, those are the Kurgun Islands. They're French. And so actually in the early days when Wyatt Earp was sailing around the Antarctic, they put a lot of oil drums there for Wyatt Earp to refuel. That was never used because Wyatt Earp didn't go there. So HMAS Labuan was used for supply and support of these stations until 1951. Following that, the MV motor vessel Kista Dan was used between 1953 and 1987. And for the last few decades, the MV Aurora Australis, shown at the bottom here in Hobart, was used instead. That vessel was owned by P&O and used by the Australian Antarctic Program. Now, when that vessel was no longer used in 2020, a temporary vessel was taken on, which was the MPV, the multi-purpose vessel Everest, on loan from the Netherlands. But as you can see in the video top right, that vessel got on fire in April 2021, and she was rendered useless for this kind of expedition afterwards. Fortunately, at the present time, the new Australian icebreaker research vessel Nuyina is on her way from the port of Vlissingen in the Netherlands to Hobart, where she is due to arrive on Saturday. So that vessel is shown at the very bottom here. It's a state-of-the-art vessel. It's been a decade in the making.
The delivery voyage is very important for us because it allows us to actually get that final confirmation that the ship's in good operating condition. It's going to be an amazing opportunity to see this ship in action in all weather on a really extended voyage.
See the ship finally come off the berth and actually proceed to sea under its own power, and it still takes my breath away when I see photos of the vessel at sea, because it's been a long time in the making, and we're almost there to have it here in Hobart and actually start working through the program which it's been designed for.
So distance-wise, it's about 12,000 miles. So we're looking at about halfway around the planet. Yeah, this is a big event in my life, and certainly a big event in the Australian Antarctic community.
Which will allow people not just to see the ship, but to understand the connection between the ship and the amazing capability it delivers. The scientific ability, the logistics ability, the Australia's presence in Antarctica that it's going to bring.
Throw the drinks on ice. We're on our way. We'll see you in 6.5 weeks, and certainly a lot more comfort and a lot quicker than Abel Tasman did in 1642.
She's steaming south right now with the Australian flag flying high. It's an incredibly proud moment for the Australian Antarctic Division.
Right, so the vessel left Vlissingen in the Netherlands on the 31st of August of this year and is due to arrive in just a few days. And this is where she is right now. I took this map from the website that's indicated there at 10:30 this morning. So she's due to arrive on Saturday. Quite exciting, and I think there will be lots of celebrations. That's where I end my presentation. Let me briefly address the question in the chat. Where did the name Wyatt Earp come from? Lincoln Ellsworth, the American explorer, named his vessel Wyatt Earp because he was a big fan of Wyatt Earp. Even though the vessel was renamed Mongala during the Second World War, and afterwards the Australian government decided to call her HMAS Wyatt Earp again during the Anari expedition of 1947-48 because it was such a well-known in Antarctic waters. Such a well-known name in Antarctic waters. So that's where I stop my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Richard, for the Navy people, the sub-lieutenant in the Wyatt Earp was Jock Yule. A lot would have remembered him long after he was a sub-lieutenant.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Oh, and I should also mention, I actually got quite taken by the LST 3501 because she's done some amazing voyages. She went 4 years in a row to both Macquarie Island and Kurgun Island. It was very difficult. She got into some trouble at some point. And so I'm actually researching her history and hope to write a book about that ship at some point.
I can send you a photograph if you like.
That would be interesting. Yes, thank you.
Right.
Richard, just to pass on the thanks of all the audience today. I think we're all fascinated by polar exploration, and I think you've reinforced for us today just that harsh environment, and just I guess showing the video of Nuina towards the end there, it just shows us, the development of ships used for Antarctic exploration. And the newsreel is really fascinating. Thanks for including those.
I had a lot of fun researching them on YouTube, actually.
Yeah. And actually, I think just my little bit of knowledge of the National Maritime Museum's collection on Wyatt Earp, it's probably makes research a little bit easier than ships like the LST 3501, which I think there's a lot less known about. And there's a personal connection between the society and Wyatt Earp, in that one of our active members was that Lieutenant Commander Bill Cook you showed smoking the pipe. And I think a large part of that collection in the Maritime Museum is actually Bill's own personal collection. But on behalf of everyone, thank you, and it was a wonderful presentation.